Good morning. Something unexpected is happening. In 2025, belief in God and the supernatural appear to be making a comeback. Now, if this were true, why would this be unexpected? Let me take you back to the middle of the 20th century. There was a movement called the Death of God, coming out of the Holocaust, and in light of scientific advancements, it was proclaimed by many theologians and philosophers that God was out of a job. Hence, in 1966, Time magazine had an iconic cover asking the question, is God dead? Fast forward to the first decade or so of the 21st century. We had this influential movement called the New Atheists, people like Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, dancing on the grave of God, so to speak, proclaiming that science has disproven God. In his book, God is Not Great, Christopher Hitchens said, religion has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. You've also maybe heard of the movement of nones, N-O-N-E-S, over the past decade or two of Americans no longer describing themselves by their religion. One could understand the claim that God is out of a job, but I think this proclamation is short-sighted. And in fact, I think some evidence is emerging that, in fact, maybe belief in God is experiencing a resurgence today. Now, how can I claim this? Number one, the God conversation is shifting on a cultural standpoint. So just one example. Many of you will be familiar with the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson, arguably one of the most influential thinkers through his books and podcasts today. He recently wrote a book called We Who Wrestle with God. Although he's not a Christian, rather than attacking the Bible as many new atheists did, he actually sees the Bible as necessary for the impetus of science and, quote, the story on which Western civilization is predicated. Other thinkers, Barry Weiss, Tom Holland, and even Joe Rogan on his podcast, having an openness to spiritual things. Second, we've seen some high-profile conversions that were completely unexpected. Just one example is the name Ayaan Hirsi Ali. Now, she grew up in a fundamentalist Muslim background, fled her place of birth, understandably became an atheist, and partnered with the New Atheists. But in November 2023, she wrote an article with the title, Why I Am Now a Christian, and is outspoken about her faith and the necessity of Christianity, in a sense, to save civilization. Third, there seems to be a growing awareness of the failure of secularism. So 2 books that have just come out, in fact, one is not yet to be released until February. One is by the Catholic writer Ross Douthat. He's a columnist for the New York Times, and he joined the New York Times maybe 15, 20 years ago during the height of the New Atheists. And he said, since that time, in his audience that is primarily not familiar with Christianity, there's a renewed openness and interest in spiritual things. Another example is the Orthodox writer, Rod Dreher, who's a New York Times best-selling author. He had a book just come out called Living in Wonder. And he talks about how the explosion of interest in UFOs and psychedelics actually points towards a deeper spiritual void that secularism cannot meet. Fourth, do you know Bible sales were up 22% roughly in 2024? Isn't that interesting? Now, why? Maybe, just maybe, there's a renewed spiritual interest and openness, you might say Aslan, is on the move. Now, my point is not that we're undergoing a revival. I think that would be premature. But the proclamation that God is dead and the supernatural is out could not be more mistaken. We are starting a series right now, and the title is Life's Big Questions. We're starting with perhaps the biggest question: does God exist? Is God real? Now we're going to look at 7 lines of evidence that God is back. This evidence started bubbling up in the 20th and 21st century into today, pointing towards the existence of God. Now, before we look at these 7 lines of evidence, none of this should surprise you or surprise me. Why? Because 3,000 years ago, David wrote in the Psalms, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night by night reveals knowledge." 3,000 years ago, the psalmist said, "When seen properly, the heavens and the sky and the natural world cry out for a supernatural cause." You might say God has placed that awareness on our hearts. So we're going to look at 7 lines of evidence from history, philosophy, and science that not only point towards the existence of God, but arguably the existence of the Christian God. Evidence number 1 that God is back is the discovery of the beginning of the universe. The beginning of the universe. Now, there's an old joke of some scientists who come to God and say, "God, we can do everything that you can do." God says, "Really? Like what?" They said, "We can make life from non-life. We can create human beings." God says, "Really? Show me." They said, "Well, first you take some dust." God says, "Wait a minute. Get your own dust." Now, where did the dust come from? Stars? Where did the stars come from? Quantum fluctuations? Where did the quantum fluctuations come from? At some point, if something exists, we need an adequate cause for its existence. Now, you might recognize the name Antony Flew. If you study philosophy and apologetics and culture, Antony Flew for 5 decades basically shaped the atheist agenda in the West. He wrote a paper called Theology and Falsification, and he actually presented it at the Oxford University Socratic Club, which was chaired by C.S. Lewis in the middle of the 20th century. And it was the most widely reprinted philosophical publication of the 20th century. He would debate Christians and make the case that God does not exist. Well, he died in 2010. But in 2007, he wrote a book that, to say the least, shook up things in the culture, namely called "There Is a God: How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind." And one thing he talked about in this book was that when he started in his life in academia, the science seemed to point away from God. But as we made a range of discoveries, it seemed to point towards at least some super mind behind the universe. And he said this. He said, "When I first met the Big Bang Theory as an atheist, it seemed to me that the theory made a big difference because it suggested the universe had a beginning, and that the first sentence in Genesis, 'In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth,' was related to an actual event in the universe. As long as the universe could be comfortably thought to be not only without end, but also without beginning, it remained easy to see it as a brute fact. And if there had been no reason to think the universe had a beginning, there'd be no reason to postulate something else that produced the whole thing. But the Big Bang Theory changed all of that. If the universe had a beginning, it became entirely sensible, almost inevitable, to ask what produced this beginning." You see, this is a simple argument called the Colam Cosmological argument. Premise number 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. If something begins to exist, there must be a sufficient reason or explanation that it began to exist. You don't get something from nothing. Whenever we see something begin to exist, we have a cause for it, and we don't see things beginning to exist without a cause. That premise is common sense and empirically demonstrated. Second, the universe began to exist. This is in part what Big Bang cosmology points towards. We haven't been here forever, but has a finite beginning in the past. And philosophy supports this as well. So if whatever begins to exist has a cause, and the universe began to exist, then the universe has a what? Has a cause, that's right. That cause must be powerful, personal, timeless, spaceless, changeless. And if not all-knowing, awfully close. You might say the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner. Second evidence that God is back in 2025, the discovery of the fine-tuning of the universe. Now, what do we mean by the fine-tune? I would imagine you come visit me and hang out with me in southern Orange County, live in a town called San Juan Capistrano. I'm pretty sure all of you at some point have been to the Mission or where the train station is at. And we go walking in some of the hills that are undeveloped back near where we live. And we come across an abandoned cabin that looks like this. You think, how interesting. Let's go explore this cabin. As you walk up, you notice something strange. You hear the sound of your favorite song, Beat It by Michael Jackson. You avoid the obvious hint and decide, let's explore anyways. You walk in this cabin and you notice something strange. You see shoes sitting in there that are your size, a jacket that fits you perfectly, the books you like to read sitting on the table. There's a small refrigerator. It's all the snacks you use. There's a tiny bathroom, and it's the exact toiletries that you use. Now, besides suspecting that you were in a horror movie, what would you think? At some point, you would stop saying, oh, what a coincidence. Oh, what a coincidence. You'd say, wait a minute. I don't know who, but someone has arranged this cabin in a fashion, and they're expecting me to arrive. Freeman Dyson is a well-known physicist. He said, as we look out into the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe, in some sense, must have known that we were coming. Now, what does he mean by this? There's certain conditions in the universe, in physics, in cosmology, that allows us to not only have a universe that exists, but to be a universe capable of supporting life. And the slightest shift in the range of these dozens of parameters, and the entire universe becomes inhospitable. You might say it's like the laws of physics and cosmology exist on a razor's edge, and the slightest shift makes the universe inhospitable to any kind of complex life. Well, there's dozens of known parameters that scientists have discovered, but what happens mathematically if we just take two of these? So if we take gravity, which has to be fine-tuned 1 times 10 to the 40th power, and the cosmological constant that has to be fine-tuned 1 times 10 to the 53rd power, what are the odds that we have just these two set where they need to be to have a universe capable of supporting life out of dozens that each need to be set in a particular range? What are the odds? Well, 1 part in 100 million, trillion, 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 trillion. In case you didn't notice, that's a pretty big number. But if you can't grasp it, just think of our new national debt. Actually, this number is equivalent to 1 atom out of the entire universe. Friends, just like the beginning of the universe points towards a beginner, the fine-tuning of the universe points towards a cosmic fine-tuner. Third piece of evidence that God is back is the origin of life. The origin of life. Now, it's a really interesting question to ask. If there is no God, how do blind processes in nature and chemicals in motion result in life from non-life? How do you get living systems from dead matter? Now, up until a number of decades ago, scientists thought there would be a simple explanation. We thought if you have the right chemicals and the right conditions, life will just pop into existence. But with the discovery of the electron microscope, where we could peer into the cell and discover DNA, we discovered a level of sophistication and complexity that goes beyond anything humans or artificial intelligence can generate today. And that raises an interesting question. If we peer into the depths of the cell, what can adequately explain such sophistication and such complexity? What can account for this? Well, to give you some context, a typical human body, and I'm like 155.9, so I guess I'm about as average as one could find. In my body, on estimate, there would be 30 trillion cells. 30 trillion cells. Now, each DNA in those cells, if you uncoiled it all, and you know DNA looks like a ladder that's kind of twisted. If you uncoiled the DNA in each of those 30 trillion cells, it'd be about 6 feet in length. That means the DNA in your body or my body strung together would go from here to the sun and back about 200 times. Now, what does DNA do? DNA stores information. That's what it does. How much information? According to one estimate, one DNA in your body, one cell in your body, has the equivalent of 8 billion letters, 500 million words, or 8,000 books. There's a reason why Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, said DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software we've ever created. Now, there is no known natural explanation of how that could occur. But Stephen Meyer, a philosopher of science trained at Cambridge, he said, whenever we find information and trace it to its source, we find an intelligent mind. If a text is legible, we find a texture. If you read a blog, you trace it back to a blogger. If you read a book, you trace it back to an author. Walk outside and the clouds say, drink Coke. None of you would say, yep, that happens when a storm is coming from the east. It'd be a mind. When we look in the cell, what do we find? More sophisticated information than anything humans are close to creating. The best explanation is the information in the cell points to an author of life. Fourth evidence God is back is the origin and nature of consciousness. Not long ago, I invited a young atheist, African-American, libertarian thinker onto my YouTube channel for a conversation. You might recognize the name Coleman Hughes. He's since become a commentator. I've seen him on CNN, best-selling author, really a brilliant thinker. We talked about race, talked about culture, and we also talked about God. And I asked him a question I would invite you to ask your non-believing friends. And it's this. I said, is there anything about the universe that gives you pause as an atheist and suggests to you there might be a God? I think that's a great conversation starter. And of two things, one, he said, consciousness. He said, it baffles me how you can get this conscious or self-conscious being through matter alone. Now, a colleague of mine who's actually spoken here, you might recognize, J.P. Moreland, arguably one of the leading philosophers of our day, co-wrote a book recently called The Substance of Consciousness. And he noted that in the 19th and into the 20th century, the idea of substance dualism, in other words, that humans are body and soul, was not only considered false, but it was ridiculed. It was ridiculed. But then he notes in this book, published in a leading academic press, he said, fast forward to the late 20th and early 21st centuries, things are changing. We're witnessing a resurgence of substance dualism, and it is undergoing an unforeseen revival. Do you realize how troubling a question this is? How do you get consciousness from dead matter? So think about pain. What is pain? You can't explain pain through physical terms alone. It has an experiential level that goes beyond matter. How about sensations? How about thoughts? You say, well, thoughts don't exist. You just gave a thought, namely that thoughts don't exist, which proves you think thoughts exist. But you can't explain thoughts and pain and ideas and sensations in purely physical terminology. There's something that goes beyond the physical. I had a debate on my YouTube channel maybe 6 or 8 weeks ago with one of the leading skeptics in the world. Maybe you recognize the name Michael Shermer, best-selling author, really brilliant thinker, fun to engage with. We talked about morality, we talked about consciousness. And I said, you believe in free will. How do you get free will? And how do you get consciousness in an atheist universe? And he said, at a level of complexity, it just kind of emerges and pops into existence. I said, that's basically a non-explanation. He said, well, sometimes at a level of complexity in economic systems, inflation just emerges. I said, inflation is so different from consciousness. It doesn't experience the world, let alone have causal powers in the world. Friends, just like there's no naturalistic explanation for the origin of life, there is no naturalistic explanation for consciousness from dead matter. And yet the fact that we are conscious beings makes sense if there is a cosmic consciousness. It fits in a Christian worldview. So you might say human consciousness points to a cosmic consciousness. Fifth evidence is the existence of the moral law. The existence of the moral law. Now, in 2010, 15 years ago, I had a debate with a high school teacher, PhD in my town in San Juan Capistrano, on whether God or evolution best explains morality. And a few weeks before the debate, I heard him on a podcast. He said, I'm about to debate this guy named Sean McDowell. He couldn't even get my name right. On whether or not you have to believe in God to be moral. I heard that. I thought, he doesn't even understand what we're debating. You don't have to believe in God to be moral. Of course, atheists can know right and wrong. And of course, atheists can be moral. And of course, Christians can be immoral. There's no reason to think you have to believe in God to know or act morally. Especially Romans 2 says, written on our hearts is a moral conscience as human beings. Even people who don't believe in God live in God's world and are made in God's image and have a sense of right and wrong. The real question is, can you have objective moral values and duties if there is no God? That's the interesting question. And here's the way the simple argument is put. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. In other words, if we are in a universe and there is no God, then moral values and duties are a fabrication. We've evolved to think they exist, but they're not a real part of the universe if there is no God. Fyodor Dostoevsky said, if there is no God, all is permissible. I think he's right. If God doesn't exist, we don't have real obligations and duties to tell the truth, to not steal, and to protect human life. But second, objective moral values and duties do exist. We all know there's right and wrong. We know that we should tell the truth. We know that we shouldn't steal. We don't need the 10 Commandments to tell us this. In fact, right now, what's interesting, this is not a political statement, but the debate in the Middle East between Hamas and between Israel, one side says Israel's committing genocide. The other side says Hamas is committing genocide. But there's no third party that says, you know what, genocide is fine. It's like picking an ice cream flavor. Why is everybody getting upset about the idea of genocide? Morality is relative. Nobody that I'm aware of, although I'm sure you could find somebody on TikTok making this argument, but you understand my point. We all know there's right and wrong. No one is really a relativist. So if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. The moral law points towards a moral law giver. Sixth piece of evidence are modern day miracles. One of the leading New Testament scholars in the world, he's brilliant. His name is Craig Keener. He was writing a multi-volume commentary on Acts. he paused and said, there's a whole lot of miracles here. I wonder if somebody's done an in-depth academic analysis of miracle claims today. And lo and behold, nobody had. So in 2010, he published, I don't know how many 1,000+ pages, hundreds, thousands of footnotes. As far as I'm aware, the most in-depth, careful analysis of miracle claims today. Now, what did he find? Quote, he said this, the kinds of claims frequently attested in the Gospel and Acts are also attested by many eyewitnesses today. Now, he studies different countries, Asia, Latin America, Middle East, US, etc. Different denominations from Catholic and Protestant, Baptist, Presbyterian, across the world. And he says there's reports of the blind receiving sight, deaf hearing, people healed from things like HIV, encounters with the demonic, and even examples of people being raised from the dead. He said hundreds of millions of people alive today believed they have personally witnessed or experienced the miraculous. Let me say that again. Hundreds of millions of people alive today believe they have experienced or witnessed the miraculous. He says, okay, I'll be conservative. Tens of millions of people alive today believe they've witnessed the supernatural. In fact, he wrote a follow-up book to this in 2021 called Miracles Today, documents further miracles and argues that some can even be demonstrated because they've been captured on video. Now, don't just YouTube miracle, especially in our age of artificial intelligence. But if you get his book Miracles Today and trace it down, he makes a compelling case that miracles, the kind from the New Testament, are still being documented today. Now, I'm curious. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if this describes you. How many of you would say you have witnessed or experienced something personally that can only be explained by the miraculous? Now, before you raise your hand, let me qualify what I mean. What I don't mean is we've recently come out of the Christmas season is, God, I need a gift for my mother-in-law. I'm going to the mall. Please, supernaturally, give me a parking space. No, I think God can answer that prayer, and he cares about the small things in our lives, but hopefully all of us can understand why a skeptic would not be convinced by such a miracle claim. I mean something that cannot be chalked up to coincidence, but you have experienced or witnessed something that can only be explained as a miracle. If that's you, let me see your hands. Put them high. Now keep your hands up. Look around. All around the world, I've done this. And this is roughly about what I see. Roughly 50% of hands will go up. You can put your hands down. If we had time, I'd love to take a mic around and hear your stories. But friends, the point is, we live in an era in which miracles are being documented, arguably like the New Testament. Miracles today point to a supreme miracle worker. So before we look at the last one, let me rehash. The beginning of the universe points to a beginner. The fine-tuning points to a cosmic fine-tuner. The information in the cell points to an author of life. Human consciousness points to a cosmic consciousness. The moral law points to a moral law giver. And miracles today point to a supreme miracle worker. Finally, the renewed case for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. How do I mean by this? If you read in historical Jesus studies or in apologetics, you're probably familiar with the name Gary Habermas. He has arguably studied the resurrection historically and academically as much or more than anyone who's ever lived. Now, he grew up in a Christian home, and he had a lot of questions and doubts about the resurrection. So as a high schooler, you remember like those note cards that you would have in old like libraries where you would pull out and you would track down a book? he would keep boxes of these note cards. And he would put the arguments for the resurrection and then objection, and he'd respond to it. And he filed these away. And then his senior year in high school, he had a paper he had to write, I can't remember, 10 or 20 pages. And he did as a high school student, investigating the resurrection. Come to the conclusion it was true. But then he went through a period of extended doubt. Deep doubt, where he explored Buddhism, considered giving up his faith. Decided to study the resurrection academically at the doctoral level. So he went to Michigan State University, and in 1976, defended and graduated with his thesis with the title, The Resurrection of Jesus, a Rational Inquiry. Now, it's one thing to write on the resurrection of Jesus at a Christian seminary. It's another thing at a public secular university with the reputation of Michigan State when you have those on your doctoral committee who have to sign off when you're making a case for the resurrection. And he passed, and has since published at least a couple dozen books on the resurrection. He's in the process right now of publishing a 4-volume historical defense of the resurrection of Jesus. As we speak, 2 volumes are out. The third one is coming out in a few months. The first volume is over 1,000 pages and weighs more than 5 pounds. Now, what's interesting is he began studying the resurrection over 50 years ago. And he's analyzed 4,500 academic resources since 1975. And what he did is he chronicles where different scholars land on certain issues. And by the way, most scholars are not conservative. Most, even in historical Jesus studies, would be what we would describe on the left. And he says there's certain minimal facts that, number one, are strongly supported by the evidence, and number two, the vast majority of scholars agree with them. So things like Jesus' death by crucifixion, that the disciples report experiences with Jesus they believed were actually appearances of the risen Jesus. Third, Saul, who was persecuting Christians, had an experience he believed was of the risen Jesus, and it changed his worldview. Fourth, although supported by slightly less number, still a significant majority, the tomb of Jesus was found empty shortly after his death. So there's certain facts that scholars agree on happened. So logically, any explanation has to account for all those facts. He says the problem is there's only one explanation that accounts for all these facts, and namely, it's that Jesus actually has risen from the dead. You say, well, what about hallucinations? Well, the problem is hallucinations can't account for the empty tomb. Maybe the appearances of Jesus, but if it's a hallucination, the body would have still been in the tomb. Not to mention, there's scant evidence for group hallucinations that change one's worldview. Now, we've looked at briefly 7 pieces of evidence that God is back in 2025. I know some of you are thinking, wait a minute, you spent 3 minutes on each of these. People are still debating them, and you're right. They're debating these online. They're debating them in academia. And I haven't addressed arguably the one piece of evidence that's often given against Christianity, namely the suffering and evil and pain in the world. But I think these 7 pieces, and by the way, there's many more than this. If you look at the Cambrian explosion, near-death experiences, beauty, there are other pointers in the universe to the divine. But I think the cumulative case that God is back is compelling. Belief in the supernatural is not going anywhere. For those with eyes to see and ears to hear, God has made himself known. From the beginning and fine-tuning of the universe to the origin of life and consciousness, to the existence of the moral law, from modern-day miracles to the historical evidence that Jesus died and was buried and rose on the 3rd day, one thing is clear. God is not dead. He's not out of a job. God is back in 2025. Can I get an amen? Amen. Father, we thank you that our church is willing to look at some of the big questions of life and that you haven't abandoned us just to say feelings or guesses or blind faith, but that you have made yourself known in history, through philosophy, and through science. I pray if there's skeptics here, you would help them ask the right questions and just guide them to see and explore the evidence. If we are Christians, may we be encouraged and strengthened by this and have the boldness to speak to other people about our faith as ambassadors for you. We praise in your name. Amen.